Well, I'm going to start with a quotation by Richard Dawkins, and some of you will know the name. He's Professor of Public Understanding at the University of Oxford, and he's on record as saying this: "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked. But I'd rather not consider that." So that's his quotation. Well, with statements like that, it's no wonder that many, perhaps most, thinking Christians seem to think that there's no real problem with Darwin's theory. Just the other day, when I mentioned that I was coming to speak on this topic here, I mentioned it to a Christian friend, the subject of this lecture. She reacted rather negatively, asking if I didn't think that the Genesis days might not be long eras, might not evolution have been the way that God did it, and so forth. For in the culture of the 21st century West, to argue about evolution is generally seen as being akin to arguing that the earth is flat, or arguing that the sun moves around the earth rather than vice versa. And so that's why it must have been a great surprise to readers of the New York Times as they opened their morning paper over their cornflakes about a year ago. And they saw an advert there, an advertisement that was in response to a statement from an American Darwinist equal in verbal aggression to the one that I read from our own British Richard Dawkins. And the advert said this: it was from about 100 scientists, geneticists, biochemists, information theorists, paleontologists, and the rest. And they stated, these 100 scientists, that they did not think that Darwin's mechanism of random mutation and natural selection could explain the diversity of life. Now, we're probably all aware of the creation science movement, which would argue that you can say on scientific grounds that the world is 6,000 years old, that the geological strata were laid down during Noah's flood, and so forth. But these 100 scientists that took out the advert in the New York Times were not from that movement, nor were they indeed from Christian colleges, of which there are many in the United States, as you may be aware. They were indeed scientists from mainstream universities, from Yale, MIT, and many others, and indeed there was one who's a Nobel nominee. And they belonged to what has become known as the intelligent design movement. So hence my subtitle about intelligent design. So right at the outset, I think it's helpful for us to know what intelligent design is and what it's not. It's not identical to young earth creationism. Some of those in the movement do accept the young earth creationist position, but by no means all. The great majority would accept that the universe is, on current understanding, about 14 billion years old, but there would be a diversity of view in the group. But it's not young earth creationism. Neither is it a program that quotes Genesis as a scientific text. That's quite important, because when intelligent design is argued in the public workplace, in the agora of public ideas, then almost immediately the critics of the theory try to get you onto the business of Genesis, and they talk about Bible thumpers and fundamentalists and all that kind of thing. You'll know exactly how it goes. But it's not a program that quotes Genesis as a scientific text. It is a scientific program, and it's based on the proposition that the natural world in general and the microscopic world of the cell in particular display design, a design that can be objectively inferred from the evidence itself. A claim which, of course, flies in the face of the Darwinist claim that design is only apparent and not really there. We'll look at some quotations about that later. Incidentally, intelligent design stops at identifying design. It doesn't go on to identify the designer, although, of course, if you have design, you must have a designer. But it leaves that to theology and philosophy, though of course the implications for philosophical theism, a position which presumably everyone in the room holds to, the implications for that are very, very clear indeed. Now, design arguments are scarcely new. They've been around for longer than the Christian era. The ancient Greek world had a conception of the world as designed and therefore implying a designer. All the way through most of the 2 millennia of the Christian era, it was accepted all the way, that is, as far as Darwin. We are probably aware of the argument from Paley, the argument from design, which is what I mentioned on the sheet there. Paley, the theologian in 1802, proposed his Watchmaker thesis. His reasoning went like this: in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there, I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think the answer which I had given before would be sufficient. On the contrary, the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehend its construction and designed its use. So there we have the Watchmaker argument. For the youngest among us, of course, we're talking about a real watch, like my late father's watch, which I wear here, one with a mechanism of intricate cogs and wheels, although it would really apply to any machine. So that's the argument then. And natural theology is something which really grew from the design argument all the way through the medieval scholastics as well as the patristic period, and not greatly used in the Reformation period, natural theology, really because of the great emphasis that came in on revelation. And it was felt that because revelation had been underplayed, perhaps, in medieval theology, then natural theology from design was not a major strand of Reformation thought, although it was there, the 2 books, the Book of the World, the Book of Revelation. And that reticence about natural theology has come into the modern era as well in the broader Reformed tradition. But even Karl Barth, who was no fan at all of natural theology, overcame his reluctance when he came to comment on that great passage in Job, chapters 38 to 42, when the Lord speaks from the storm and challenges Job. And when you read Barth in that passage, then he overcomes his reluctance and draws the obvious conclusion that any Christian reader would do from that passage. But Paley, although it may seem obvious to the Christian, is by no means accepted nowadays in mainstream science. The criticism of Paley was mainly that his understanding of design was essentially subjective. He had no rigorous criteria for saying that is designed, but that is not designed. If it looked designed, then that was all he was really arguing. And that's where intelligent design comes in. That's indeed why it's called intelligent design, because it's based on a rigorous and objective definition of what might constitute design, and it applies that to the natural world. So you see, it is quite a step on from the old Paley argument. But before considering the Dawkins challenge, the blind watchmaker, which of course is the main challenge to Paley's view, I'd like, and then we'll be looking in detail at intelligent design, I'd like, by way of continued introduction, to speak a little bit about the philosophical materialism and methodological materialism in science. Again, that's on the sheet. Philosophical and methodological materialism. I think this is a helpful background to the main issues today and to helping understand the vigorous debate that's going on. Well, methodological materialism, that's really just a way for saying that is how science does its investigating. Science can only investigate something which will happen Again, it's not the same as saying that science is all there is. It's well known, I'm sure, that most scientists in history were theists. So they didn't believe that matters, particles were all that was really there. They believed that in an orderly universe, and that was what led them into their scientific endeavour. We've got various people: Johannes Kepler, Blaise Pascal, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, Charles Babbage, Gregor Mendel, Louis Pasteur, Lord Kelvin, James Clerk Maxwell. All of them would have agreed with Einstein that science without religion is lame and religion without science is blind. So that is the mainstream historical position of scientific research, that you have a methodological materialism but not a philosophical materialism. So you're focusing on what you can replicate in the lab, what you can observe from the phenomena, but you're not saying that the phenomena, matter, energy, is all that exists. That's a completely different position. And what has happened is that over the years, the philosophical materialism has encroached into science. Now, what we could say there, I heard a tape of Ranald Macaulay speaking. I don't think it was this meeting, was it the meeting in Fife a couple of years ago? And he put it like this. He said that science is a bit like a rocket being sent off from a battleship. It was something that came from the Christian worldview. So the argument that the universe was orderly, we should expect it to be orderly because we believe in a God who is orderly. That got science going. But over the years, and in particular since the time of Darwin, that rocket has turned round and has come back to blast away the culture that actually gave birth to it. This is very clearly seen if we look at some quotations. You may remember the series Cosmos that was on the television, 20 odd years ago, Carl Sagan. And he starts his television series by this quotation: "The cosmos is all there is, or was, or ever shall be." Now that is a statement by a scientist, but it is not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement coming out of the mouth of a scientist. In fact, very interestingly, it has resonances with the creed, does it not? The God who is, was, and ever shall be. The cosmos is all there is, or was, or ever shall be. So that's philosophical materialism coming into the picture. Again, a couple more. Man, this is George Gaylor Simpson, prominent biologist in the United States. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Now, these things are presented as conclusions from scientific investigation, but in fact, they're presuppositions before you even look at the evidence. Here's another one, John Maynard Smith, who's evolutionary biologist at University of Sussex, very great authority in evolutionary biology today. Every society has a myth of creation, such as Genesis, and that story invariably carries a moral message. Darwin replaced those myths with a story that was utterly amoral. And that leads us straight, of course, into the culture of today, relativism, postmodernism, where philosophical materialism, the idea that matter and energy is all there is, or was, or ever shall be, completely dominates our culture. It completely dominates the secular media and so forth. Modern science, another American biologist, modern science directly implies that there are no inherent moral or ethical norms. So claims this biologist William Provine. And again, you can see very heavy influx of philosophical materialism into science, which was never by its founders intended in that way at all. It was intended that there would be a theistic framework, and within that you could do some investigating. So things have changed. So we're told, you see, by the likes of Provine that the philosophical materialism comes after observing. But it doesn't. It comes before. It comes before. Science does not directly imply that there are no inherent moral or ethical norms. Science isn't capable of making those kind of deductions, because those kinds of statements belong to the greater metaphysical world and not to science itself. Well then, yes, there's one more, I think, which is helpful to quote, and it's Richard Lewontin, geneticist, prominent geneticist from Harvard. This is the longest quotation, but I think it's very important. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, how the elephant got its trunk, that kind of thing. We do that because we have an a priori commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. It's not that. But on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So there's a gentleman who's very honest indeed. That is the position. They cannot allow a divine foot in the door, no matter what the evidence says. And it's to move on to that evidence which intelligent design tries to do. Now, I'm going to mention, now moving on to cosmology. I won't be saying a great deal about this, not because it's not fascinating and important, but because it's not really the main subject of intelligent design. But I think it's an important one because it reminds us that we do have a universe that's designed. And this is something which is not, it's not something that's based on ignorance. You know, there's the old God of the gaps idea that because we don't know something properly, we always say, well, God did it. And then as research goes on and more is found out, we find out the mechanism and say, well, it was a bit silly saying God did it. It's not that kind of argument because it's actually based on more and more research. And the more and more cosmologists find out about the universe, the more amazingly designed it seems to be. For example, if the force of gravity was just a minutely bit stronger, then every star in the universe would be what they call a red dwarf, wouldn't be able to sustain matter, too cold to support life. If it were slightly weaker, the force of gravity, then all stars would be blue giants and they would burn just too briefly for life to develop. And the finely balanced nature of some of these forces is so completely against the idea that we're just a random explosion that even atheists would say things, they use the words like tailor-made, they use things like we are meant to be here because the universe is so very, very finely tuned. One of the constants, I'll not go into all the details, is finely tuned to the extent that it's 1 times 10 to the power 40. If it was any little bit more than that. Now that is a most enormous number. I don't know if any of you are mathematicians, you know that's a huge number. I heard it illustrated by Dr. John Lennox, who said this. He said, if you got a 5p piece, covered the continent of Russia, built it as high as the moon, got 1 billion continents like that, and then you threw in a red 5p piece and jumbled them up and asked someone to try and find it. That is the chance that the fundamental constants that we see in the universe are just happen to be. So then you say, well, if even atheists are using the word tailor-made, if they're using the word designed, then surely that implies that there is a designer. That's when this business of parallel universes comes in. Parallel universes, people say, well, it's clearly too much of a fluke for our universe to be the way it is. Therefore, there must be an infinite number of other universes, and our one just happens to look that way. Our one just flukishly, out of a trillion others, just looks designed. Now, the only thing there is, there's not any evidence for any other universes. So if we think that science is about studying what is there, then we're really hemmed into this idea that we're tailor-made, designed this universe. And speculation about other ones, which you will sometimes hear, is purely to escape the obvious conclusion from the science. You see, the obvious conclusion from the science is that it is designed, that there must therefore be a designer. People don't like that, so you can guess we're into Romans 1, where you have clever ways of denying what should be staring people in the face. So that's the cosmological one. But the main thing I'd like to say today is about biology. And that brings us on to, if you're following through there, Darwin and Dawkins. And it was the Paley idea of design took a severe knock from, first of all, Darwin, who said, well, basically said God had nothing to do with it. This is, people sometimes get down an alleyway of saying, well, Darwin wasn't an out-and-out atheist, and there's comings and goings on the evidence on that. But really, Darwin relegated God to the realm of somebody that would never interfere in anything, that never had anything to do with anything. He may be there, and when this issue is debated today, people will allow a being, or they will allow the idea of God, and they'll point to people in churches who believe in evolution and say, well, what's your problem? But Darwin really removed God from the business of creating life. And then when Richard Dawkins, who would be the prominent popularizer of Darwin in the modern world, he came along and said what the watchmaker may be there, but he's a blind watchmaker. Look at a couple more quotations here. Richard Dawkins' biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And he would then focus all his emphasis on the word appearance. Whereas we might reasonably say, well, maybe they give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose because they were. But to escape from that, we have the idea of the blind watchmaker. Biologists, Francis Crick, the discoverer of DNA, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. You see? So you've got to keep pinching yourself if you're an evolutionary biologist, because otherwise you might be led into sloppy ways of thinking and thinking that something was designed. But you've got to dig yourself in the ribs and say, no, it's not designed, it's something that evolved. Now, the blind watchmaker is the way of saying that random mutation and natural selection caused the appearance of life itself, of simple forms of life, of complicated forms of life coming out of that. And that's where Dawkins says, yes, if there is a watchmaker, then he is a blind watchmaker. It's just a random process. There is no direction. There is no sense in which there was any purpose in it. When I was a first-year plant science student in the University of St Andrews, I remember sitting in a lecture and being told by a lecturer to avoid teleology. Now, when I'd found out what the word meant, which it means arguing that something has a purpose, and he said that's bad science. Now, the strange thing was, this was an evangelical Christian, this man, member of the Baptist Church in St Andrews, and yet he was saying avoid teleology, avoid the design idea, because that's thought to be bad science. You see, it's thought to be bad science. And I remember thinking, what I would now say was that it was counterintuitive, because surely if something looks designed, it has to have a designer. But no, since the time of Darwin, we've been told that design must be ruled out, because that's not scientific. That brings in the supernatural. And it's, I would say, suppressed. The idea of design is suppressed. And it's this point precisely that intelligent design contests. And that's why it is a controversial discussion in mainstream science, because for the evolutionary biologist to even raise the question of design is per se to be unscientific. And this is what what intelligent design contests. Well, you'll be glad to know we're moving on to the main section there, number 2, and we see what it is that intelligent design is contesting. We do have to look at a number of what you might call technical terms and concepts. First of all, specified complexity, and secondly, irreducible complexity. Now, I do hope that if you don't have a specialist background that I will be able to explain what these things mean. I'm not, I may say, a specialist in information theory, nor am I a specialist in biochemistry, but I think it is possible to see the importance of these things because they directly challenge what I would call anti-design bias, which is at the root of all modern biology. Well, the first one then, specified complexity. Now, specified complexity is a technical term for really saying not just that something is complex, but that it's complex and it fits a pattern which could only have arisen from the input of intelligent design. So to say, now to answer the question that biologists, evolutionary biologists would say, the main point I mentioned before, that science can never consider the question of design, people like William Dembski would argue, well, it does, because in other branches of science it's done all the time. If you take forensic medicine, then a distinction is made between a hammer falling on someone's head by accident and the attribution of intentionality in that event. Distinction is made between a random event and a designed event. The same thing we get in archaeology. Archaeology has got tried and tested methods for distinguishing between a pebble and an axe. One is the result of random processes. The other is clearly designed. Think of the hieroglyphs in Egypt. Could natural processes have resulted in those patterns that we see in the ancient Egyptian writing? Well, we look at that phenomenon and we make a design inference. That's what this means, a design inference, that no, that couldn't possibly be the case because no natural process could result in anything as clearly having had an input of design. Somebody writes, John loves Mary on the sand, on the tide. And you go along and you look at that phenomenon and you say, could that have been made by natural processes? And the answer, we make a design inference, no, it couldn't. And what the intelligent design people, and Dembski in particular, William Dembski, are saying, they're applying that same process of design inference to the field of biology, and in particular cell biology. Another example, the hunt for extraterrestrial life. Billions are spent a year on that. Billions of pounds are spent, dollars, looking for extraterrestrial life. And what they're looking for is to distinguish between random radio background and a signal. I don't know if any of you have seen the film Contact. Any of you seen that? Contact is where contact is made, and the way in which it happens is that a signal comes in, which is the series of prime numbers going up, and again there's a design inference. Could a sequence of random signals have resulted in the series of prime numbers? The answer is clearly no. That would be a product of intelligence. And those are the techniques which Dembski and others apply to the cell and say, well, if we think one is looking for aliens, finding that pattern means that there's an intelligence out there, why can we not use the same techniques to look at the genetic content of the cell? Now, I wonder if we could have that heat off. Would that be all right? I think it's quite warm now. This all sounds a bit abstract, so here's some illustration of it. If I were to tell you that I'd got my box of Scrabble letters, tipped it onto the table, and that I'd come up with that, you would say, well, yeah, I mean, that's not a controversial statement, is it? That is a complex string, but that's all it is. If we said it's the result of random processes, we could quite easily believe that. If I were to say that my Scrabble letters came into that sequence, what would you make of that? Well, I think it's pretty obviously an excerpt from Churchill's speeches, isn't it? That couldn't have happened. If we said that 4 letters came out and they were those 4, we would say, well, yes, that is just possible. It's maybe not very likely, but if you chose 4 letters at random and put them randomly together, it's possible that you would get that. But is it possible that you would get that? No. But that is just what the random mutation natural selection theory advocates. Richard Dawkins, in his book The Blind Watchmaker, talks about complex information coming on a random basis. He actually says that if you got a monkey at a typewriter, now, you'll maybe know the illustration. You say, if you get a monkey at a typewriter forever, would it ever come up with Shakespeare's works? And people say, well, no, it wouldn't. Dawkins says it can do, because if you wait until the first letter, say a T in the word the, comes up, you won't have to wait too long till it randomly comes up, and then you wait until the H comes up, and then you wait until the E comes up, and there you've got the first word of a sentence. And he says, well, that's the way it was with genetic information in the cell. But there's a problem with that, because you can only get the monkey to randomly, so-called, come up with that sentence if you program the sentence in the first place, if you put the target in. Do you see what I mean? So it's not a fully random process, and Dawkins doesn't seem to realise it. Others have done. Sir Fred Hoyle, who died not too long ago, said that the blind watchmaker argument was like saying a tornado going through a junkyard can result in a jumbo jet. It just isn't going to happen. So William Dembski develops this theory of specified complexity and brings an objective mathematical test to whether something was designed or whether it's not. And he doesn't see why biology should be immune from that any more than forensic science, archaeology, or anything else should be. Now, the second concept is irreducible complexity. Now, the idea here is that in the Darwinian view, any phenomenon that we see in nature, in the biological world, must have been built a step at a time. We're familiar with that argument, I'm sure. It must be step by step. Well, the more that's been found out about the subatomic or the subcellular biochemistry of the cell, then the more difficult that seems to be. This here is, don't be alarmed at the word E. coli, you'll see, it says E. coli. This is a conceptual diagram of the motor mechanism of E. coli. It's one of the simplest forms of life, the bacterium, and it's got a little tail, a flagellum, by which it swims around, and this is how it flips around. But the proteins that make it up are really, they all have different jobs, one like a rotor, one like a bearing. It flips round 100,000 revolutions a second, but it can stop in a quarter of a turn and then go the other way. Absolutely amazing. Now, the second name that I mentioned there, Behe, Michael Behe, he looked through the literature to see how this could have been built on a step-by-step random basis. And he looked through 20,000 articles about the bacterial flagellum. It's interesting that there are so many people excited about the bacterial flagellum, but there you are. And there is not one reference to any possible Darwinian mechanism whereby you could get these step-by-step assemblage. And the illustration he uses, I think, is a helpful one. He says it's like a mousetrap. Now, we all know what a mousetrap is. It's got about 6 parts. Now, none of those parts is of any use without the whole being in place. So if you were to come along with a theory that said the mousetrap was randomly built a step at a time, we would say, of course not. Because without a spring, it's no use. Without the gearing, this is no use to the bacterial flagellum, so why would it have a competitive advantage? Do you see the argument there? So that's why he comes with this concept of irreducible complexity. And there are many, many things in nature which are irreducibly complex, which are not possible to have come about a step at a time. It just doesn't work. Well, the third thing on this I'd like to look at is the origin of life. The origin of life. And this is one of the most tricky ones for Darwinism. The idea is that you've probably seen, was it in the cartoon Sorcerer's Apprentice, I think, right at the beginning, there's primeval soup and there's a flash of lightning and all this kind of thing, and that's the popular view. But it isn't borne up by the facts. There's a biochemist called Dean Kenyon, who was co-author of what was the foremost text for over 20 years. It was called Biochemical Predestination. And he thought if he got all the different pieces of the jigsaw in place, all the different proteins, then you could see how the building blocks of life would come about, biochemical predestination. But one day, one of his students asked him, how could proteins self-assemble in the right way without the genetic information, the instructions, already being in place? How could the proteins get assembled in the right way unless the instructions were already in place? And he saw straight away that it couldn't be done. You can't have a blueprint pre-existing and then say that it's come about randomly. And so he would be someone who has, as it were, jumped ship. You can't get this business coming, working in the right way. Just to say, the concept of information is a very key one in intelligent design. If I had a computer disk with me which had my talk on it, and then if I held up that in one hand and the printed manuscript on the other, you would say that the information content is the same, even though the molecules are different. On the one hand, it's plastic and magnets, and on the other hand, it's paper and ink. But there's something in that, embedded in the molecules, which is information, namely the talk that I'm giving today. And so information itself, you see, is invisible. Information is there, it's held in the mesh of the molecules, but it's there before the molecules. It has to be. You cannot get the cell developing unless the DNA is there with the encoded information. And the encoded information of DNA is of the kind of complexity that this string is here. It's language-like. It's language-like. We would never think that this here was a random lot of letters. Well, the information content of the cell is language-like. It's as specified and complex as that. So there are many, many problems. What then are the implications for Darwinism? Well, I hope you'll have seen that there are plenty so far. There's the problem of why should we throw out design before we even look at the phenomena? That's held to be scientific, but it's not. What about the biochemistry? What about the information content of the cell? All these things. There are other problems as well. I'm going to mention just a few in a field that I knew more about myself. My PhD was in palynology, which was a pollen analysis of sediments. And whilst they were recent sediments, it does mean that I know a bit about the geological column. And of course, if you ask Darwinists where the evidence for the geological column is, then you get told it's the evidence of evolution is, you get told it's in the column. I'm sure we're all acquainted with this kind of diagram, the tree of life. Vertically, we're getting to more recent time, and the idea is that a long time ago there were fewer types of organism. This just has morphological distance. That means the different body plans. Vertebrates would be one of these. Invertebrates would be another. Sponges, corals, all these different things. But if you look at the evidence, this is what you find. You find that at one point, about 600 million years ago, in the conventional reckoning of the geological column, you get this sudden explosion of different body plans. And almost all of the major body plans, you see, date from then. Some of them die out again. So that's what's predicted. That is what we find. Again here, putting the same thing in a slightly different way, the Darwinian prediction would be that over the course of time on the bottom now, over the course of time, you would get an increase in the number of life groups, number of phyla. What you actually get is a low number to start with, a huge increase at what is the start of the Cambrian, that's why it's called the Cambrian explosion, and then a decreasing number since then. So again, big problems there if you're looking at the geological evidence. Again here, some of the things, corals, mollusks, so forth, and we'll be familiar with this kind of thing if we've ever studied biology. We have a kind of tree with the different things here. But if you take away the conceptual framework, if you take away the orange lines, you're left with something where some of them come in 500 million years ago, some about 450. Would you really draw this kind of picture from that if you weren't convinced already in your mind, if you weren't determined to make them join up for a common ancestor? Do you see the point? All the different types come in more or less during this Cambrian explosion. And so it's not well established that it's not well established that you get backing for the Darwinian theory in these different ways. Because Darwin's theory really, well, it can mean, what does the word evolution mean? It can mean many different things. It can mean, for example, first of all, just change. There was an advert, evolution, change. There was an advert for the Reno Laguna a couple of years ago. The new Laguna, it's evolved. And was that by random mutation, natural selection? Well, no, it wasn't. But that, in the sense there, evolved just means changed. Secondly, we can be talking about microevolution. That's to say variations in finch beaks, that kind of thing. The development of resistance in crops, resistance to pesticides, that would be microevolution. Then it can mean macroevolution, which is how major organs came to be, how limbs came to be. That's also evolution. The next type of meaning would be Darwinism, in the sense that what we can call random mutation and natural selection, RMNS, the idea that that accounts for 2 and 3. You see, that's evolution as well. Then there's the whole business of common descent, the belief that all things came from one ancestor, that's evolution. Then there's artificial selection, dog breeding, that kind of thing. That's evolution, so we're told. And then there's chemical evolution, which is the origin of life, the primeval soup. Now, you can see straight away, to argue against evolution is very, very difficult because it's a slippery, slippery term. Some of these things are entirely non-controversial. Number 1 is non-controversial. Number 2 is non-controversial. Change? Yes, well, of course. We all know that things change. We get older, we change. Microevolution, crop resistance, finches getting slightly different length of beaks. That's uncontroversial. But it doesn't tell you how you got finches in the first place. artificial selection, dogs and cats and things, completely uncontroversial. But of course that is with the input of intelligent design by breeders over many years. But those three definitions, entirely uncontroversial. The other senses in which the term evolution is used are, I hope you can now see, really very controversial. But what happens in public debate is that a kind of slipperiness comes whereby if you criticise number 4, somebody will say you must be mad and tell you about number 2 and number 6. And they'll say, well, that's evolution. Surely you accept that. And you must be a flat earther if you don't. So you can see that it's quite a difficult business. The implications for Darwinism, though, on the basis of the evidence are, I hope, clear enough. And what it comes down to is that the three really big names in 20th century culture, Marx, Freud, and Darwin. Now, Marx is out the window now. Freud, so my psychologist friends tell me, is out the window as well. And I firmly believe that Darwin will eventually be rejected as well. If you know anything about Marxism, you'll know that it was a theory that didn't really explain anything. If workers had their wages very low, then the Marxist would say, look, that's exploitation of the proletariat. If a liberal government raised the wages of the workers, they would say, look, that's a capitalist plot to try and keep the proletariat from going into revolution. So you see, whatever the evidence said, they said, that's Marxism, that proves it. Even completely opposite things were held to prove the theory. And it's the same with Freud, psychoanalysis. If anyone disputed, there was a time when anyone who disputed the theory of psychoanalysis, well, all you would get was a knowing look and the sure certainty that you needed to be psychoanalyzed. And if you dispute some of the tenets of Darwinism, some of the controversial ones, well, you'll find if you look into it that the evidence is made to fit the theory, as I hope I've made clear. And so I do believe that eventually that theory will go the same way. Well, if, like me, you're persuaded that intelligent design has significant possibilities for Christian apologetics in the 21st century, then the question arises, is a slight variation on Schaeffer's, how should we then live? And becoming instead, as I say on the sheet there, what should we then do? There are separate implications, I believe, for the Christian community and for wider engagement with the secular culture. Well, first of all, addressing the Christian community, there's a clear need for education and information on these issues. In the case of our young people, it's absolutely vital. Remember those quotations about Darwinism having an implication that there are no moral norms. I wonder how many teenagers from church backgrounds have been lost to the faith because they have absorbed uncritically, even perhaps unconsciously, the idea that God really has been explained away by science, and that science really does prove that we are the product of blind and purposeless processes. Incidentally, a science student who gets informed about these issues won't become hopelessly confused, as some might think. He or she is likely to become a far better scientist, more able to weigh evidence and relate that evidence to theories than one who accepts dogma in the teeth of the evidence. But we're engaged really in an attempt to change mindsets. And if you want to do that, you have to know what it is you're trying to change. What then is the Christian mindset on origins? There is, of course, like many things, more than one. Among evangelicals, those who accept young earth creationism will clearly need no persuading on the design issue. What they might care to ponder is the wisdom of getting too engaged on what we might call secondary issues, such as flood geology and the age of the earth. Now, these things are interesting enough in their own way, but at least in public debate, I think they must take second place to the primary issue of design. We cannot afford to let the secular materialists off the hook on the really big design question. And that's what will happen if time and energy is spent in public debate on issues that can all too easily be exploited as a distraction from the primary issue. Well, although some may accept young earth creationism, the majority evangelical view, at least in the Western world, is likely to be a tacit acceptance of theistic evolution. In some ways, this is perfectly understandable, since most people think, however mistakenly as we've seen, that evolution is a fact in the same way that the earth moving around the sun is a fact. So when God created, they think, well, that's the way he must have done his creating. Yet evangelicals should at least be open to the possibility that the facts of biology and geology do not compel a Darwinist conclusion, and indeed in many ways are quite at odds with such a conclusion. And when this is realised, the words theistic and evolution might come to be viewed as unhappy bedfellows, if not downright oxymoronic. After all, evolution, as construed by both Darwin and Dawkins, is by definition non-theistic as regards biological origins. And given the clear prominence of the role of creation, the doctrine of creation in Scripture, no evangelical, and indeed no consistent theist, can accept that humanity is the product of blind, purposeless processes that did not have him in mind. And if the evidence doesn't actually demand it, then there really is no need for anyone to be pressured into accepting that that's the way God must have done his creating. In the case of the liberal Christian tradition, the task of persuasion presented by intelligent design will be much more formidable. Those of us in so-called mainstream denominations should be under no illusions about this. Not only is Darwinism all but universally accepted in liberal circles, whole theologies have been erected on the premise that evolution is true. I have here in mind such things as process theology and Ruth Page's ecofeminism, which one or two might have heard of. People with theological training tend not to be well aware of the scientific issues. So there may be paradoxically less willingness to consider the claims of intelligent design in theological circles than in scientific or educational ones. Anyone wishing to query the dogma of blind, purposeless processes should therefore be prepared to expect opposition on two fronts. Frontal opposition from committed secular materialists and opposition in the rear from those in the church who quite genuinely, I may say, feel that to query evolution in public debate is merely to score an unfortunate and embarrassing own goal. What then about engaging with the wider culture? Well, the urgent need to engage with the wider culture on this matter is easy to see if we ask ourselves a few questions. Why should an aggressive materialist philosophy going under the guise of science go unchallenged in the agora of modern Scotland? Why should our children be taught that science says there is no God when science says no such thing? Why should it be considered scientific to say that we are the product of blind and purposeless processes, a conclusion which, as we have seen, flies in the face of the scientific evidence? And why should it be considered unscientific to say that the natural world implies an input of intelligent design? Above all, why should we not get a seat at the famous postmodern table to put a different view? Well, I'm going to argue what might sound strange from a Bible-believing Christian, that we should not begin with the Bible in public debate on this issue. As I hope I made very clear earlier, the question of design can and should be argued on the basis of the scientific evidence itself. It should go without saying, though, that intelligent design is entirely compatible with theistic belief, with Genesis 1:1, with John 1:1, with Psalm 19, and with Romans 1:20. So intelligent design can be thought of as a kind of natural theology. The Watchmaker has indeed returned, although, of course, he was never away. But in fact, although intelligent design has philosophical and theological implications, it is primarily science and should be argued as such. Opponents of intelligent design are all too willing to portray the debate as religion versus science, but the real debate is rather more subtle. We need to alert the public to the distinction between science that is based in evidence and science that is merely a cloak for a highly dogmatic and aggressive philosophical materialism. Well, as I've found out firsthand from a brief foray into the letters column of the Scotsman, to engage with these issues in debate is to stir up quite a hornet's nest. Intelligent design is regularly abused as thinly disguised creationism, which it's not, at least in the term in which creationism is usually used. Design theory is abused as non-science, notwithstanding the fact that it uses scientific means, because its conclusions don't fit the secular script. Even to query the dogma of blind purposeless processes is indeed to invite ridicule and flat earther parallels. But we do need to engage with this issue because of the implications for the wider culture and the uncritical acceptance among journalists and movers and shapers of our society of the materialist worldview. And if we want to engage properly, we're going to need a network of Christians who are well informed and properly briefed. I'm having in mind a network of teachers, scientists, journalists, even maybe the odd minister. It may involve monitoring the science curriculum. We've got that in the USA. I'll just briefly put that here. The Senate passed something last year which requires students to understand the full range of scientific views that exist, why such topics may generate controversy, and how scientific discoveries can profoundly affect society. And biological evolution, it's now quite acceptable to teach the evidence against evolution in schools, in science classes, as well as the evidence for it. Really what we need in Scotland is to look at things like that and to look at the curriculum, if necessary, attempting to have that curriculum improved so that Darwin's theory is subject to the same critical scrutiny in our classrooms that we have a right to expect in the case of all scientific theories. For the heavens really do declare the glory of God, and God's invisible qualities really have been seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. It's high time that the suppressing of this truth, in which we in the past have perhaps too willingly acquiesced, should increasingly be challenged on the basis of the natural phenomena themselves. Schaeffer talked about true truth. Well, here is a true truth with which to finish. In the beginning was the Word. Something which we think of in one particular way, but which has a great plenitude of meaning, calling in mind the information behind the cell, all these things. In the beginning was the Word. Thank you.